January 1945. Somewhere beyond the Rhine before dawn had fully admitted the day, the air inside the camp kitchen hung thick with steam. Tin trays clattered in uneven rhythm. Boots scraped frozen ground outside. A ladle struck the rim of a metal vat, and the sound carried through the barracks like a bell from another world. Men who had marched through ruined villages and slept beside collapsed. Stone walls stood in a line that smelled not of smoke and horse fat and old cabbage, but of warm milk, boiled grain, sugar, and coffee. On the far side of that line, under hanging clouds of vapor, there appeared something almost absurd in wartime. A pale mound of sweet rice, glossy with heat, portioned onto American trays, as if war itself had paused to make room for dessert. For some of the German prisoners staring at it, the first disbelief had nothing to do with taste. It was visual. In the last phase of the war, a man learned to measure an army by what remained on its tables, bread reduced to darker, thinner slices, meat replaced by rumor, soup that showed more water than substance, coffee that was no longer coffee, sugar that vanished first from the tongue and then from memory. By 1944 and early 1945, in many sectors, the German soldier had become familiar with a shrinking world, less fuel, less ammunition, less certainty, less food. The war, which had once promised speed and thunder, had hardened into exhaustion, so the sight of a sweetened rice dish being distributed by an enemy army did not merely surprise. It contradicted the logic by which many of them had endured. This was the deeper shock. Not that the Americans fed their own soldiers. Every army had to do that. Not even that Americans fed prisoners decently. Under the Geneva framework and for reasons both legal and strategic, that too was possible. What unsettled men formed by years of discipline, rationing, and propaganda was the suggestion of excess without panic, abundance without ceremony. The tray did not carry luxury in the aristocratic sense. It carried something more dangerous to ideology, normality, warm food, enough of it. A sweet course after the main portion, not on a holiday, not in some officer's private dining room, but on a military tray. The kind of gesture only a system confident in its depth of supply could make. The United States had built that confidence not by accident, but by scale. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. Army procured roughly 1 billion special rations at a cost of around $675 million, creating a logistical food system vast enough to follow American forces across oceans, mountains, jungles, deserts, and frozen roads. Its wartime ration family included emergency D bars, daily C rations, lightweight K rations, and the larger 10-in-1 group ration, whose menus could include meat units, vegetables, coffee, jam, evaporated milk, candy, biscuits, and even pudding. That industrial fact matters because it explains the emotional one. Sweet rice on a tray was not just a cook's indulgence. It was a visible fragment of a machine so large that it could still afford softness in the middle of global war. To American soldiers themselves, not all of this food represented comfort. C rations were notorious for monotony. Ham and lima beans inspired complaint. Canned meals were heavy to carry, and K rations, issued especially for short, hard combat operations, offered only about 2,830 calories a day, which many troops considered insufficient. Yet even these disliked American rations contained signals of material reach: candy, gum, cigarettes, coffee, biscuits, multiple meal components, and a calorie structure that reflected systematic planning rather than improvisation. 3 daily C ration meals could provide about 3,700 calories. To an American infantryman, that might mean inconvenience, weight, repetition. To a hungry enemy accustomed to shortages, it could look like another civilization entirely. And that is where the sweet rice becomes powerful. Because on paper it is small: rice, milk, sugar. A spoonable thing, no weapon, no medal, no flag. Yet war often reveals itself most nakedly in what men eat when no one is trying to impress them. In that sense, the dessert on an American tray could tell a truth that speeches could not. Germany had taught its soldiers to admire hardness. Sacrifice, iron will, obedience, austerity, historical destiny carried through suffering. The state was to be measured by endurance. But the Americans seemed to suggest another measure of strength, one less theatrical and therefore more disturbing. That real power might be the ability to feed millions well enough that sweetness could survive administration. The German soldier of 1939 had marched under very different assumptions. The early victories in Poland, France, the Low Countries, and the Balkans had created an atmosphere in which speed itself became ideology. Blitzkrieg was not merely strategy. It was proof, many believed, that Germany's new order was sharper, leaner, more modern, more ruthless, and therefore more fit for history than the fat democracies it despised. Propaganda painted Britain as decadent, America as materialistic, democracy as slow and spiritually weak. Hard nations, it was said, were made by want, discipline, and will. Soft nations drowned in comfort. The men who internalized such beliefs did not imagine that comfort might also be organized, weaponized, industrialized. Then the war lengthened. It entered Russia and did not leave. It crossed Africa and burned through fuel. It met bombing, attrition, and winter. Factories had to replace not only losses but illusions. The German rationing system strained under military demand, transport damage, labor shortages, and the relentless arithmetic of total war. Civilians felt the tightening. Soldiers felt it faster. Meat became thinner, fresh foods grew rarer, ersatz substitutes filled cups and bellies but not confidence. A veteran could read the future in bread texture and soup thickness. Long before headquarters admitted anything had changed, many German soldiers still fought stubbornly. That must be said plainly. Hunger alone does not dissolve ideology, nor does a good meal instantly liberate the mind. But the mind under war is not transformed by one sermon. It is altered by accumulations, a battlefield rumor, a village untouched by propaganda, a captured truck loaded with supplies, a can of food whose label speaks in another language but whose richness needs no translation, a cigarette, white bread, chocolate, coffee, fruit, or one morning sweet rice. The United States held more than 425,000 prisoners of war during World War II, most of them German, with smaller numbers of Italians and Japanese. This presence created tension among American civilians, some of whom believed POWs were treated too well while American soldiers were dying overseas. Yet the treatment had logic. It was tied to international law, reciprocity for American prisoners abroad, and the broader American confidence that feeding the enemy decently did not weaken victory. At camps such as Papago Park, official and press accounts emphasized discipline, occupation, and good meals as part of camp management. Prisoners later remembered the food and fair treatment among the most striking features of captivity. That fairness, of course, was never simple innocence. America did not feed German prisoners generously out of sentiment alone. Great powers rarely act from a single motive. There was pragmatism in it, calculation in it, a public relations dimension in it, and an implicit contrast with the world the Nazis had built. Good meals could preserve order in the camps. Good meals could support reciprocity for Allied captives. Good meals could also perform a kind of political argument without needing to announce themselves as one. Here is your tray. Here is your bread, here is coffee, here is enough, here, even now, is dessert. Imagine the internal dislocation of that moment. A man raised amid slogans of racial hierarchy and national mission, told that democracies were decadent, now discovers that the decadent power not only defeats him materially, but also places on a tray the sort of sweet course his own wartime life has nearly forgotten. He does not have to admire the Americans. He does not even have to like them. He only has to register that their abundance is real. Once that reality enters, propaganda must work harder to remain intact. This was not limited to prisoners behind wire. Across fronts, German troops occasionally encountered captured Allied supplies and noticed what they implied. American logistics had a texture: abundant canned goods, cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, packaged bread items, chewing gum, concentrated rations, standardized kits, endless shipping, endless wrapping, endless replacement. The D-ration bar itself, dense, hard, almost punishing by design, still delivered more than 600 calories and was produced at massive scale. Hershey's first turned out 90,000 bars in 1937 for testing, and wartime military chocolate production later became a symbol of U.S. industrial mobilization. Even the emergency chocolate bar, which the Army had intentionally ordered to taste only a little better than a boiled potato, testified to a national system capable of converting chemistry, manufacturing, and transport into portable calories for a world war. There is something almost cruel in abundance when seen from the wrong side of defeat. Not cruel because it is withheld, but cruel because it exists, because it forces comparison. One can hate an enemy more easily when he appears monstrous or starving or fragile. It is harder when he appears organized, provisioned, and calm enough to serve a sweet course. The sweet rice on the tray becomes unbearable, precisely because it is ordinary. It says, our ships arrived, our milk powder arrived, our sugar arrived, our rice arrived, our kitchens function. Our quartermasters count, our rails run, our factories fill, our state survives even the details. And the details mattered. Armies do not move by speeches. They move by calories, salt, fuel, packaging, rail timetables, warehouse inventories, slaughterhouses, dehydrators, canneries, laboratories, and men with clipboards who understand that a war is won not only by taking hills, but by feeding those who must climb them. In this respect, American food represented more than wealth. It represented system. The enemy saw not just sweetness, but coordination. Somewhere in that line, a prisoner lifts the spoon. The rice is softer than expected. The sweetness is modest, not extravagant, but unmistakable. Milk rounds the grain. Heat travels from mouth to chest. And for an instant, the war rearranges its language. This is not the vocabulary of frontline deprivation. It is not the old grammar of turnip stew and black bread and endless substitute coffee. It is nourishment unashamed of comfort. A childish thing, perhaps, this sweetness. But children's things can be dangerous to brutal ideologies because they imply futures. The symbolism deepens when one remembers what rice pudding or sweet rice means in culinary history. It is not an aristocratic feast. It is a humble dish made from staples transformed by care. Grain softened over heat, milk added, sugar spared, time given. It is the sort of food that belongs to households, barracks, hospitals, schools, institutions meant to preserve life, not spend it lavishly. That is why it worked so well as a psychological emblem. A roast might suggest victory. A cake might suggest celebration. Sweet rice suggested continuity. It implied that the society producing it had not stripped itself down to bare survival. It still remembered how to make staple food gentle. For men formed in the brutal late-war environment of the collapsing Reich, gentleness could itself feel alien. Their horizon had narrowed to utility. Fuel for motion, bread for endurance, soup for heat. Yet here came an enemy who, even in war, organized morale not only around necessity but around the management of appetite and habit. American operational rations evolved through repeated testing, field feedback, climate adaptation, and nutritional experimentation. The point was not elegance. The point was reliable sustainment on a global scale. Once you possess that scale, small luxuries cease to be luxuries. They become routine. This is where perception changed, not all at once. Not in every man, but in enough of them to matter historically. The war had taught German soldiers to distrust softness, to equate scarcity with seriousness. Yet now they faced the possibility that the side with deeper reserves, better fed troops, wider menu variety, more chocolate, more coffee, more canned meat, more powdered milk, more transport, and more room for dessert was not spiritually weaker but structurally stronger. Plenty once mocked as decadence began to resemble competence. That realization could wound pride in a very specific way. It was one thing to be beaten by an enemy believed to possess superior numbers. It was another to sense that this enemy's entire social model, its factories, farms, roads, bureaucracies, commercial scale, packaging systems, and domestic abundance, had become part of the battlefield. The sweet rice on a tray did not merely feed the body. It humiliated a worldview that had promised that hardness alone would prevail. There is a broader wartime irony here. American troops often complained about what German prisoners found astonishing. C rations were called heavy, repetitive, monotonous. K rations were criticized for low calories and bad taste. The D ration bar was deliberately unpleasant. This contrast matters because it reveals the relativity of morale. An American soldier judged food against the memory of home. A German prisoner, especially late in the war, judged it against shortage. One man saw inconvenience. Another saw evidence of an empire of supply. One man groaned at canned beans. Another stared at sugar on rice as if it were a strategic secret. History is filled with such asymmetries. The ordinary on one side becomes revelatory on the other. A tin opener, a packet of gum, a chocolate bar, white flour, fruit preserves, butter spread, evaporated milk. In the 10-in-1 ration, the very inclusion of pudding alongside meats, vegetables, coffee, biscuits, candy, and accessory items shows the texture of American wartime provisioning. It was not crude survival alone. It was managed morale, menu rotation, and the recognition that even mass war runs partly on the mind. It is tempting to over-romanticize this and say one spoonful of dessert destroyed Nazism inside a captive heart. History is never so theatrical. Many prisoners remained committed. Some camps contained hardened Nazis who intimidated fellow captives. Ideology does not vanish because rice is sweet. But the human mind records contradiction with ruthless accuracy. A man can preserve old beliefs publicly while privately absorbing facts that corrode them. And one of the facts late-war German soldiers encountered, sometimes more shocking than artillery, was the astonishing depth of American material confidence. Confidence is the key word. Not wealth alone, confidence. A frightened system hoards. A brittle system reduces. A confident system can allocate, diversify, and still keep something in reserve for morale. It can ship coffee and cigarettes with calories. It can experiment with menu combinations. It can supply thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions, and still allow the daily meal to hint at normal life. In war, that is not softness. That is endurance in administrative form. The recurring image returns. Steam rising from the tray, grain swollen in milk, sugar catching light spoon against tin. Outside Europe is rubble, rail yards broken, cities burned open to weather. Churches roofless, farm fields cratered, families divided by fronts and bomb lines, but in the American kitchen line there is sequence, order, ladling, portioning, counting, replenishing. The war may rage outside, yet inside this little ritual of feeding there survives an argument about civilization itself. Not a perfect argument, not a pure one, but a real one. That institutions matter, that systems matter, that how a nation feeds, even in war, reveals what it believes human beings are for. German soldiers had been taught that the state existed to harden man into instrument. American abundance suggested a competing vision, that the state, at least in part, existed to organize life at scale, to feed bodies, stabilize routines, and preserve ordinary expectations even under extraordinary strain. Sweet rice on a tray did not prove American innocence. It proved something subtler and perhaps more consequential in the psychological contest of the war, that democracy, industry, and consumption could cooperate rather than collapse into weakness. There was symbolism in grain itself. Rice, after all, is modest. It multiplies in the pot. It is a food of number, of distribution, of feeding many. Sugar and milk elevate it, but not into opulence. They elevate it only enough to say, there is room for care. That is why the dish haunted memory. Not because it was the greatest meal of the war, but because it was the simplest contradiction of everything scarcity had taught. On the Eastern Front, a man might dream of meat. In captivity, he might remember instead the insult of sweetness, and perhaps that insult cut deepest precisely because it awakened buried civilian memory. Before for uniforms and ideology, many of these men had known kitchens, mothers, sisters, wives, childhood tables, winter dishes, festival puddings, the domestic calendar of ordinary Europe. Total war brutalized that memory, replaced it with uniform portions and military necessity. Then, unexpectedly, the enemy's tray returned a fragment of household softness. Not home, never home, but enough to remind a man that the regime that demanded everything from him had not been able to preserve even the little mercies of peacetime. The transformation, then, was not merely political. It was emotional. A spoonful of sweet rice could not teach constitutional theory. It could, however, expose the poverty of a myth. The myth that harshness alone is noble. The myth that comfort corrupts all strength. The myth that a society concerned with feeding even prisoners decently must secretly be decadent. In that kitchen line, a quieter lesson emerged. Material abundance, far from erasing resolve, can underpin it. American wartime food systems were never glamorous, but they were formidable. They rested on farms unbombed by the Luftwaffe, on industrial capacity expanded by mobilization, on shipping protected at immense cost, on standardized production, on research laboratories, on companies capable of manufacturing emergency chocolate by the tens of thousands, and then the millions, on quartermasters who thought about jungle rot, desert heat, mountain load, and menu fatigue. When this machine touched the prisoner's tray, ideology medley organized plenty. It could terrify, extract, and destroy. It could make men harder. It could make them hungrier. Democracy, for all its noise and contradictions, could do something the totalitarian imagination often underestimated. It could build systems vast enough to feed millions, adaptable enough to innovate, and confident enough to let a soldier, or even a prisoner, encounter not only calories, but a hint of normal human sweetness. So the scene remains: a winter morning, steam, tin trays, a line of defeated men, an American ladle moving with almost bureaucratic indifference. And there, where one expected only necessity, a pale serving of sweet rice settling into metal. Not grand enough for monuments, not loud enough for battlefield legend. Yet somehow more revealing than either, because empires speak most honestly not in their slogans, but in what they place before the hungry. Long after guns fell silent, it would still be possible to imagine that spoon striking the tray, that brief white curl of steam lifting upward, that first stunned recognition that this, too, was part of the enemy's power. Not merely the shell, not merely the tank, not merely the aircraft overhead, but the milk, the sugar, the grain, the transport ship, the warehouse, the ration plan, the kitchen order, the confidence to serve dessert in wartime. In that sense, the sweet rice was more than food. It was evidence. Evidence that freedom, whatever else it fails to do, can create abundance broad enough to escape the banquet hall and enter the barracks. Evidence that a society does not become weak because it remembers comfort. Sometimes it becomes stronger at infrastructure, and infrastructure usually wins. Even now, when historians read camp recollections and supply records, what lingers is not only the scale of armies, but the intimacy of logistics. A prisoner remembers food. A guard remembers lines, crates, vats, coffee urns. A cook remembers substitutions, transport delays, quantities. Governments publish tonnage. Men remember taste. Between those two registers lies the real human history of war. That is why the image endures so powerfully. Not because sweet rice altered strategy, but because it condensed strategy into sensation. One could hold it on a spoon. One could taste an entire supply chain. One could feel in warm milk and softened grain the distance between a regime consuming itself and another system still rich enough in resources and confidence to feed war without surrendering the grammar of ordinary life. Outside the mess area, the winter remains severe. Wire fences stand, guards watch, trains groan somewhere far off, no one mistakes desert for freedom. Captivity is still captivity. Defeat is still defeat, yet symbols do not ask permission before entering history. The tray has already spoken. The sweet rice has already done its work. It has shown that America's strength was not only in bomb tonnage, convoy counts, or divisions assembled across oceans. It was also in the quiet administrative miracle of making abundance visible, where Europe had forgotten the shape of enough. And perhaps that is one of the larger truths of the war. Tyranny could command sacrifice, but it could not rely because it knows how to preserve it under pressure. Evidence that ideology can promise destiny, but only functioning systems can fill trays. And so one of the quietest scenes of the war becomes one of its clearest metaphors. A defeated soldier staring at an enemy's dessert and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that power is not always iron-faced. Sometimes power arrives warm, white with steam, carrying the scent of milk and sugar. Sometimes it asks nothing, declares nothing, simply rests on a tin tray and waits to be understood. Sometimes history changes not with the crack of a rifle, but with the soft surrender of rice beneath a spoon.